A while back, I read the book Reflections on Violence by George Sorel, and I thought it might be nice to do a detailed explanation of this book so that you can kind of understand why it's a classic and also see its influence today. Now, I should say at the outset that I'm not a Marxist revolutionary. I actually don't really like Sorel's ideas, but that doesn't mean that I can't give you an overview. And I was mostly reading this book as kind of background research for another book that was published in the same year, and that would be G.K. Chesterton's novel The Man Who Is Thursday, which is one of my favorite books. So in 1908 then, this is when George Sorel publishes his work Reflections on Violence, and he is putting in book form what had already come out 2 years earlier as a series of articles in Mouvement Socialiste, basically a journal or magazine. So in this text then, he takes a kind of Marxist approach, you might say, and he talks about a future catastrophe. This is the moment when the next era will be ushered in, right? And then, of course, we will all live happily together and so on. Now, the thing that will precipitate this change for him is what he calls the general strike. Okay, so the general strike. And this is where all the unions go on strike at the same time. The government can't really do much about it. And as a result, this will lead to a transition. Now, Sorel says you don't need utopian plans for this. It's a seamless transition. It will just kind of happen naturally at that point. So what are some of the preconditions for this catastrophe? How is it going to take place? Well, Sorel has a particular theory of what needs to happen, and he basically argues that what we need is gradual economic progress, okay, so progress, in which we have increased democracy, the economy is doing well, and we also need increased class conflict. Okay, so we need to have two classes, right, class conflict. And these classes, obviously one is the proletariat, the other one is the bourgeoisie or the upper classes. These two classes need to become differentiated more. And one way in which that can happen is through lots of individual strikes. So not the general strike, right, the strike to end all strikes, but smaller strikes that over time really make the bourgeoisie annoyed and angry with the lower classes. So rather than kind of give them nice things and so on, they actually become more bitter, more capitalistic, more selfish. And for Sorel, this is a good thing because we need that division. We really need two very separate classes in order to create that final conflict that leads to the general strike. Now, if we think about the lower classes then, these tend to organize themselves into unions, and this process Sorel refers to as syndicalism. Okay. And he argues that these unions should own the means of production. Okay, so gradually they will own the means of production, and as a result, when the actual catastrophe happens, when the new society is created, then the nice thing is that the workers have already kind of organized themselves socially, and as a result, Marxists and syndicalists like George Sorel don't really need to worry about training the workers to start a new society. They don't have to come up with a plan for what that society should look like. The workers will have already organized that society in the workshops and the factory, and as a result, it will happen naturally. There's a quote here. He says, "Socialism has no longer any need to concern itself with the organization of industry, since capitalism does that." Right? Capitalism forces workers into these kinds of social organizations. So that seems very fortuitous, and it makes it easy for Georges Sorel. He doesn't have to come up with a plan, really. It's just going to happen. Now, the other thing that he can say is that, yes, we have this big general strike at the end, but before that, we also need some smaller strikes. We don't need a ton of them. We just need some strikes in order to kind of create this class conflict and all this tension in society. So he says, for instance, it is possible, therefore, to conceive socialism as being perfectly revolutionary, although there may only be a few short conflicts, provided that these have strength enough to evoke the idea of the general strike. So they have to make people think, oh, we can at some point also have the general strike. And this introduces an important idea, which is the idea of myth. So I'm just going to put this in the top corner here because it's a really critical idea. Unless we have a myth that we can believe in, that there's going to be this catastrophe, right? This is a sort of myth of the end times, then we won't be motivated to act. And George Sorel is all about motivation. So we need myths, we need stories that can inspire us. He doesn't believe as much in rationalism or utilitarian ideas or mechanistic explanations. He wants something that can really inspire you to take action. I've got a couple quotations here about myth. He says, "It is the myth in its entirety which is alone important. Its parts are only of interest insofar as they bring out the main idea," right? And the catastrophe, the general strike, these are myths that will make people excited to go on strike and to do all these things. He also says, "We do nothing great without the help of warmly colored and clearly defined images." So you can see here how George Sorel is important for the history of psychology as well, the sense of how does history change? And a lot of historical change is really due to people believing in a cause rather than other explanations that, let's say, Marx might have offered about the base influencing the superstructure, let's say. It's not so mechanistic, right? It's more what makes people tick, what makes them do things. All right, now the problem for George Sorel, in a sense, is that history is actually progressing in a different way as he is writing. And what's really happening at the same time is that we have this sort of piecemeal progress. Okay, so we have socialists in government, and we refer to this as parliamentary socialism. Parliamentary socialism. Okay. And one of these politicians, one of these socialist politicians, is a man named Jean Jaurès, who basically Sorel initially really liked for his role in the Dreyfus Affair, which started in 1894 and then led all the way to 1906. But Sorel became disillusioned with Jaurès. He basically argues that he will usher in a dictatorship of the proletariat. We'll come back to that term. So he doesn't really like him. And his problem with the parliamentary socialists is that they want gradual revolutions. Okay, so they want to have one strike here and maybe another one there, and then they'll get some small reforms, and then the government will give a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And actually what happens as we progress then, yes, society gets a little bit better, but we don't have this sharp class conflict because basically the upper classes are giving in a little bit towards the lower classes. And to really have that final general strike, we need that sharp conflict. So the kinds of strikes that we have in this form or in this version of history are what he calls political strikes. All right, so political strikes. There we go. And these are mostly organized by politicians. They want to strike to further their own ends, but then they get a little bit of improvement, but the politicians basically just want to stay in power themselves, right? That's their main aim. So parliamentary socialists like Jaurès, they basically want evolution, not revolution. They want gradual kind of change. All right, a few other things we can say about these patterns. So as we have this economic progress, as we said before, for Sorel, this really needs to happen at a time where there is a renaissance, he calls it, a renaissance. And there are different ways to spell this, so we'll spell it like it's spelled in my edition of the book. What he does not want is the revolution, the final catastrophe, to happen at a point where there's decadence. All right, so he does not want decadence. This is where people are kind of lazy and corrupt and whatever else. It needs to happen when society is actually progressing. And so you can see here that capitalism is in a sense a good thing because we want capitalist progress. The economy has to be hot. Whereas a decadent society is not a good time to start a revolution, because in any revolution you always conserve something as well. You take with you whatever was there before. And so you need to make sure that the right things get kept, which you can't really do as well in a period of decadence. Now, as we compare these two ways of looking at historical change in the future, there's one more set of terms that we really need to know here, and that's the fact that for Sorel, the state always uses what he calls force. Okay, so it uses force, whereas a true revolution uses violence. All right, so this is a really important distinction in his work. And to some extent, we might be skeptical and say, well, you're just assigning terms as you like. But it's nevertheless interesting to see how he works with these terms. So he says the term violence should be employed only for acts of revolt. We should say, therefore, that the object of force is to impose a certain social order in which the minority governs, while violence tends to the destruction of that order. And you can see then that the parliamentary socialists also just want force, right? They want to be in control, but they still want the state to use force. Whereas violence then becomes this good thing for Sorel. As you have strikes and you destroy things and so on, it's a kind of beautiful violence that goes beyond the power of the state, is not tainted by it, and somehow is more pure. It's better. And in fact, throughout the book, he talks quite a bit about types of violence that are not state-sanctioned that he quite admires. So, for instance, he loves vigilante justice, he likes vengeance, he likes lynch laws. He talks about, places like Denver in the 19th century. He talks about Norway, small societies where people practice vengeance. So it's really fascinating to see how he admires some of these things. As long as it's not the state, it's often a good thing. All right, so at this point then, we've seen how he talks about the future. But as you can see, I have this whole timeline here as well, which relates to other moments in history. And what we're going to do next is see how he interprets the past. Because he's so focused on myth, right, the idea that we live with myths and we need myths in order to motivate us, the past gives us a lot of lessons about how myths and stories have motivated people in those times. So let's go back then in time and get a bit of a sense of what he is saying. He starts actually with the Greeks here. So he starts with the Greeks. And he says the Greeks can be divided into two groups, really. On the one hand, we have the optimists. And he includes in their number Aristotle especially. He doesn't like Aristotle. Aristotle talked about the golden mean, right? You have to have the balance between two extremes. And Aristotle's golden mean, Sorel calls it an ethic adapted to consumers. So he's very skeptical about it. He doesn't like people to be too optimistic. And what he wants instead is he wants to be seen as a pessimist, but a realist pessimist. So yes, there are obstacles in the future. It's going to be difficult to have the general strike, but that's to be realistic. And that's better than to be falsely optimistic or to tell those kinds of lies, right? At the same time, the Greeks also had poor warlike tribes. And he quite admires these folks. They were willing to sacrifice themselves in fighting for an ideal. This is the only way in which you can have moral progress, according to Sorel. You have to fight for something. And then as you are a member of the tribe, whether it's a Greek tribe or the syndicalists later, you will hate the other side, right? You will impose your will on them and use violence to get your way. As we move ahead then, he turns to the beginnings of Christianity, and he points out that the Edict of Milan here brought in Christianity as really a state religion for the Roman Empire. But the problem is that after the Edict of Milan, which created a lot of tolerance for Christianity in the Roman Empire, we also have the fall of the Roman Empire, right? Fall of the Roman Empire. And according to Sorel, what happened was that Christianity became dominant in a period of decadence. So the empire was fairly corrupt, and because you have decadence and then you have a revolution, that's going to lead to trouble. And that's why the fall of the Roman Empire happened soon afterwards, because the state religion then took over many of these societal structures, and it couldn't really move beyond it very well. Between these two dates here, we also have Christians often being persecuted, living in the catacombs. Okay, so we'll just write that here, the catacombs, living underground. And George Sorel argues that very few people were actually persecuted, that the Christians like to tell stories of martyrdom. He's very skeptical about this. But he uses this to say, hey, look, you only need a few stories of martyrdom. You don't really need a lot of them in order to inspire people, right? Again, we have this myth that's being created. The early Christians believed that Christ would come back soon, usher in a new kingdom, and this really motivated them. And they didn't need tons of stories about martyrs. They just needed a few in order to inspire them. Then we jump forward to the Protestant Reformation, similar kind of story about inspiration through myth. Here's a quotation. He says, "The Protestants, nourished on the reading of the Old Testament, wished to imitate the exploits of the conquerors of the Holy Land. They took the offensive and wished to establish the kingdom of God by force. Calvinism was finally conquered by the Renaissance, and it finished by becoming simply a lax Christianity." So people became too casual about their religion. There's a lot we could say about this. We might quite disagree and say, well, Calvinism, Lutheranism, they were not principally militant forms of Christianity. We're not going to get into the details here, but you can see how every time Sorel interprets history in the same way, right? He's trying to find out what motivated these people. I've also put here the birth of Blaise Pascal, the French philosopher, who's usually seen as a Catholic, but Sorel really likes to think that he has Calvinist influences as well, or tendencies. And when he talks about Pascal, he talks especially about what Pascal has to say about justice and natural law. And basically for at least Sorel's understanding of Pascal, he thinks that justice for Pascal is just the application of force. So if I go to one country, the government will say this is justice and they will use force to impose it. I go to another country, they have a different idea, and you can see there's a very skeptical idea here about justice. Moving ahead in time then, we have the French Revolution. Okay, and the French Revolution, Sorel is quite negative about it because he argues that this really leads to the dictatorship of the proletariat. Dictatorship, there we go, of the proletariat. And what he means by that is the idea that after the French Revolution, the people who are now in charge still use the violence of the state, which he calls force, if you remember, and they use it to dominate and to control people. They kill prisoners, they, send them to the guillotine and so on. And one thing I do quite like about Sorel is that he does not like violence that is selfish, that is vindictive, right? He says, after the revolution, you do not go after individuals. The vanquished are not fair game, right? You have to treat them fairly. And he actually has an interesting quote about this. He says, force after a proper revolution, is then displayed according to its own nature without ever professing to borrow anything from the judicial proceedings which society sets up against criminals. It's a fascinating quote. It's easy to overlook, but I think it's a really critical passage in the book, because what he's really anticipating here, I think, is what Walter Benjamin, a later writer, would refer to as a kind of pure or divine violence. This violence that is separate from state authority and somehow is morally justified. Now, the next thing in this history then is Napoleon coming on the scene. And the thing that Sorel admires about Napoleon is that he was very good at using myths in order to inspire his soldiers. So his soldiers were willing to die to get glory, right? And in order to kind of increase the glory of the fatherland, you might say as well. So Napoleon then succeeded in part because he used myths, but also because he took over in 1899 at a moment when there was a renaissance. The economy was hot, it was doing well, and what we also see at this point is that there were still all those bureaucratic structures left over from the old regime, from before the French Revolution already, and as a result, this revolution conserved things that were effective at the same time. So again and again, we see Sorel looking back at moments and saying kind of, well, this worked, this did not work. As we move on in the 19th century, there are lots of details we could mention. I've just put the death of Karl Marx here to give you a bit of a sense of when Sorel is writing. What we also have during this period is a kind of Catholic revival. So Catholic revival. And Sorel says this is effective because the church stresses that it is a church militant, that it's not just a weak church, but it's willing to fight for what it believes in. And the other thing is it insists increasingly on its mysteries rather than try to explain them in a rational form, rationalism, enlightenment, that kind of thing. The fact that the church is willing to leave some of its doctrine or its ideas a bit more obscure is actually favorable to the church, because in any sort of myth, as Sorel sees it, something that is obscure, something that is darkened, is precisely what gives it a sense of mystery and what makes people intrigued and eager to learn more. So that kind of brings us back then to 1908. Now, as time went on, it actually turns out that Sorel himself gave up mostly on syndicalism for a number of years, especially in 1910 and the following years. He turned more and more towards nationalism, and in that sense, he actually inspired people like Mussolini. Mussolini apparently said, I owe most to George Sorel, which is a bit surprising perhaps after he seemed like such a Marxist. But if you think of Mussolini, if you think of the Nazis, we tend to think of them as more right-wing, but as the introduction to our book also points out, this is Edward Schill's writing, Edward Schill says, if you look at it carefully, often the far right and the far left have a lot in common, which is a very perceptive comment, I think. Schills also has another scathing thing he says about Sorel. He says Sorel may have been a syndicalist himself, he may have admired those groups, those unions, but, quote, Sorel had no organizational responsibilities in this movement and little close personal connection with its members. At a distance, he admired its resolute class separatism. Which I think is interesting, right? That he wants to be a theorist, he wants to pass on his ideas, but he's not actually closely connected to the people that he is talking for or on behalf of. And he tends to refer to them in quite abstract terms. He refers to his own ideas as the New School, and his opponents, the parliamentary socialists, he sees as the worthy progressives, a very sarcastic kind of term. The last thing I'll mention here is that in this book, there's also an interesting reflection on art, and it's very short. It's really towards the end. Okay, so there's some thoughts about art, and basically what Sorel says is that artists are often trying to produce something really great, something that stands out, something that will last in time. And in the same way, workers also try to perfect the forms of production. They try to create better tools, better technologies. So the artist then can be a kind of symbol of the worker who in his union, his or her union, works hard to create a better society, a better relations of production, and all of that will then lead to the general strike, which will lead to the better society. As we look back now at this book, having kind of introduced it here, I hope you'll agree with me that it's a very idealistic book, probably somewhat naive. It's not quite how history has gone. I'm not a Marxist by any means, so I have a difficult time finding much here to really admire other than individual comments and observations. But what is important is especially this conception of violence, the sense that somehow we can find a better violence which is morally justified, which is outside of what the state sanctions. And that's a very difficult project and one certainly fraught with problems. So I hope you enjoyed this introduction to Georges Sorel's Reflections of Violence.